أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. عسى ربكم أن يرحمكم وإن عدتم عدنا وجعلنا جهنم للكافرين حصيرا. إن هذا القرآن يهدي ويبشر المؤمنين الذين يعملون الصالحات أن لهم أجرا كبيرا. وأن الذين لا يؤمنون بالآخرة أعتدنا لهم عذابا أليما. ويدعو الإنسان بالشر دعاءه بالخير وكان الإنسان عجولا. وجعلنا الليل والنهار آيتين فمحونا آية الليل وجعلنا آية النهر مبصرة لتبتغوا فضلا من ربكم ولتعلموا عدد السنين والحساب. وكل شيء فصلناه تفصيلا. وكل إنسان ألزمناه طائره في عنقه ونخرج له يوم القيامة كتابا يلقاه منشورا اقرأ كتابك اقرأ كتابك اقرأ كتابك اقرأ كتابك اقرأ كتابك كفى بنفسك اليوم عليك حسيبا من اهتدى فإنما يهتدي لنفسه ومن ضل فإنما يضل عليها ولا تزر وازرة وزر أخرى وما كنا معذبين حتى نبعث رسولا وإذا أردنا أن نهلك قرية أمرنا متر فيها فحق عليها القول فدمرناها تدميرا وكم أهلكنا من القرون من بعد نوح وكفى بربك بذنوب عباده خبيرا بصيرا صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Because this idea of wealth inequality and disparities, especially in the United States, but around the world, sort of forks into many different other things, right? So I'm not going to focus on any one thing, but I will bring them up. I know that there are other speakers who are infinitely, more knowledgeable than me on some of these topics. And so they're going to delve deeper into it. But I am going to be touching on various different things. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, okay, so before we even really start here, when we talk about the Black tax, what is that? I guarantee you that almost every single Black person listening to this right now knows exactly what the Black tax is. It's encompassing of a few different things, but number one, the Black tax refers to the idea that you have to be, as a Black person living, particularly in the West, you have to be twice as good in order to get half of what people who are white or who have proximity to whiteness have. We can get into what that means in a second, but you have to be 4 times as good to get any kind of opportunities that are afforded very readily and almost expected for white people to have and people with proximity to whiteness to have. The other thing that it refers to, and I think Trevor Noah kind of defined this very well, at least this facet of it, in his book, Born a Crime. He says, because the generations who came before you have been pillaged, rather than being free to use your skills and education to move forward, you lose everything, just trying to bring everyone behind you back up to zero. And we see reflections of this in Malcolm's own life. The idea that you don't work in order to live or to thrive in any way. You work very, very much so in order to survive. And a lot of the things that he has done in his life, it's following that model, right? So, and those same issues did not go anywhere. 56 years, in a couple of days, it'll be 56 years since this man passed away, right? Not even since he was born, but since he died. And we are still very much talking about these things. And, you can say that everything has changed and you can say that nothing has changed. And the fact that both of those statements are true is appalling, right? So for instance, today, Black people account for 13% of the population of the United States. But guess how much wealth they command in this country? 2.6%. Right? And the conversation about, median household incomes and things of that nature, people dispute. But let's say, for example, one study conducted said that the median household income for a white household in this country, in the United States, is $76,000, right? And for Blacks, it's $46,000. And even if, there are some that actually go much, much further than that and say it's actually, for whites, it's close to 170,000. And for Blacks, it's, somewhere around 17,000, which is insane, right? It's inconceivable that, someone will have 10 times the amount of wealth and access that I have, and yet claim that, there is something inherent, like the reason I'm not earning enough is because there's something inherently sort of wrong with me. And I found this really interesting. There was a study conducted in 2016, which said that if the sources of income for white families just completely out of the blue stopped, right? White families just stopped earning any money, it would take the average Black family 228 years in order to catch up to where the white family had stopped, right? And incidentally, 228 years is about the amount of time slavery lasted for, okay? So this kind of wealth disparity affects so many different things. It affects, for instance, school funding, because school funding is directly correlated to the value of the home in the neighborhood in which you live. Okay, and thanks to the homeowners loan corporation, which was sort of established by FDR in the 1930s as part of the New Deal after the Great Depression, guaranteed home loans for everyone, right? But they found a very strategic way to systemically exclude Black people from that. What happened is, because of segregation in this country, you had, Black people could only live in certain areas, okay? So what the Loan Corp did is they said, well, we'll guarantee loans to everyone. They told the banks, we'll guarantee loans for everyone, except for people who live in these areas, right? And they could do that as a company. So that's what they did. And which areas did they say, we're not going to guarantee loans for these people? It's where essentially all the Black people lived. And that still, to this day, still happens. Home ownership is the number one driver for wealth in this country, at least. And you can use a home to pay for college. You can use a home to start a business. But since Black people do not have access to that, right, to the kind of generational wealth, especially as it pertains to home ownership, right? The idea that you live in the same house that your mother and your grandmother grew up in, right? Frankly, I don't know anyone who is living in the same house that their great grandmother lived in, right? I don't know of any Black people, but I can name 20 or 30 white people that I know who live in the same home that their great grandparents owned. So again, this affects housing, and wealth affects housing affects education in large parts, because school funding is directly tied to the value of the home in the neighborhood in which you live. And access to education affects access to wealth and income. And again, these are vicious cycles that we have not mastered the essence of breaking systemically, right? Because again, this is a systemic problem. It is baked into the law of this country. And this is even before we get into employment systems and prison systems and the 13th Amendment, which are all separate, that's a whole separate kind of nightmare. But yeah, we're still dealing with a lot of these things. And in the book, in chapter 5, I believe, Malcolm actually talks about seeing this for himself, because where does he go? He goes to Washington, D.C., right? And he talks about how you see this, modicum of wealth and privilege when you are standing anywhere near the White House and the Capitol and all of that, right? There's this it's a very tangible privilege and wealth that you can see, right? And as someone who lives in the DC area, I can tell you, it's still the same, right? You go to Pennsylvania Avenue and, Capitol Hill, all these, lawyers and journalists and people with power and education and privilege live in all of those areas. And those areas are not cheap to live in, right? It costs literally even rent a room in DC, not a whole house, not a whole apartment, to rent a room in DC is about $2,000, right? Somewhere in the ballpark a month. So, but then you go to some areas of Southeast DC and there is so much poverty. People who have not eaten in days, right? And all of these charity organizations that run soup kitchens, and literally DC is not that big. I don't know, but for those of you who've been, it's like maybe 7 or 8 miles in each direction. So it's not that big at all. And in some cases, you are literally standing, if you're standing in one place and you look to your left, it's someone's, luxury apartment, and you look to your right and it's this broken down building that has lead paint in it and all these other things. And 9 times out of 10, it's white people who live on this side and Black people who live on this side. So that's still, it's not even that, it's still the same. That's the problem. Nothing has changed. If he was to go to DC today, it would be the same exact situation. The only thing that would probably be different is the amount of wealth that, the people who live in sort of, I guess, what we would call the white side of DC have, right? Because the rich get richer and the poor get much poorer. And I also think it was interesting that in a lot of places throughout this book, Malcolm equates whiteness to wealth, right? So he says white New York, right? Where he mentions after he leaves DC, he is driving into New York City and he's looking, right? And you can tell very clearly which part of it is white New York and which part of it is, you know, the Black or the poor New York. And even today, we still use that as shorthand, right? We still, amongst ourselves in our communities, we still do that. White is equal to rich and Black is poor, very much so. And the other thing that I wanted to mention, Shalina mentioned this in sort of the summary, is that sex work shows up again and again and again in this book, right? In Malcolm's life and just in the people that he's around. Why is that? Because we have a system where women especially have an even harder time gaining these skills than the men do. And so you do what you can with what you have, right? And that's not to say that we, you know, condone that, but you have to think about the systems in which people grow up and what they think they have access to. You know, Malcolm also talks about the fact that growing up, like he told one of the teachers that he wanted to be an attorney, right? And the attorney told him, oh, that's not something a Black person can do, right? You're good with your hands, go be a carpenter, right? And so again and again, if you live in a society where they're constantly using derogatory language in order to refer to you, you don't have access to the money and the education, you can't really do anything except for work with what you have. And what did they have at that time? Sex and drugs, right? Malcolm X, the leader that we now, you know, use as shorthand for liberation and, you know, sort of movement of civil rights, was a drug dealer and a victim, for lack of a better word, of the school to prison pipeline, right? In a lot of ways, he did not have a chance. And so he learned that the best way to make a living in this society is to give them essentially what they want, right? He talks about when he was selling sandwiches, for instance, he talks about the fact that, you know, he sold more sandwiches than the person he was supposed to be temporarily replacing, because he learned that all you have to do is give white people a show, right? And they'll buy whatever it is that you're selling. And also this idea of code switching in order to fit in is another facet of this story. Sort of change, again, that's another term that I think most of the Black people in the audience are familiar with, but the idea of changing your tone of voice, how you speak, in order, the kind of slang that you use in order to kind of allow yourself to be seen as not as threatening, right? If I can sound like a white person, I'm more likely to get the job than if I sound ghetto or whatever that means. And so I also think it's interesting, he brings up the concept of we were servants and psychologists, right? So they looked at us as less than them, while at the same time, we were looking to them and learning what it is that they wanted and sort of trying to fit that mold in order to just get by, right? And again, we still do this. A very simple example of this is how Black people choose to wear their hair, right? I mean, I wear hijab, so that's another separate thing. But for those who don't have that kind of dress code, you have to straighten your hair in order to even get in the room for an interview in a lot of different companies. And if you don't straighten your hair, there's something wrong with you, and you get perceived in a different way. If a Black person walks in with dreadlocks, for instance, they're perceived very differently from someone who walks in and their hair is straight and or curly, in order to kind of look like the white people in that environment. And you still get harassed. And think about what you're getting harassed for when we talk specifically about hair. We're talking about being harassed for wearing your hair in a lot of ways the way that it naturally grows out of your scalp, right? And it's so, I mean, I don't really have words to really do it justice, because it's so appalling, right? What do you say to that? And there's a line in the book also where he talks about how he felt as though he was making someone uncomfortable, because he was this tall Black man, and his sort of stature. And he said, I made her so uncomfortable that we were both glad when I left, right? Because he didn't want to be the one who made her feel a certain way. And again, that's still something that happens, right? Inherently, Black men and women are viewed as threats in this country. That's why you have, the sort of the police brutality problem that you have in this country. But back to sort of the essence of the neighborhood that he was living in, particularly in Harlem. He said that today, the descendants of the same immigrants who came, from elsewhere in order to settle there were kind of accepted by the Black people in that community. Those same immigrants' descendants are running as hard as they can from the descendants of the Negroes that helped those immigrants, their grandparents, unload immigrant ships, right? The idea of everyone running when Black people show up to a neighborhood. And incidentally, this is a conversation that's happening also in this country about the gentrification of certain cities and parts of America, right? If there are too many Black people, white people have to show up and make it hip and cool to live there, again, while still denying the same kind of access that they have even in those communities, right? So even if you live in a quote unquote Black neighborhood and you're a white person, chances are your kids don't go to those same schools, as those Black kids. And the other thing I wanted to touch on is this idea of whites only businesses, and also Black owned businesses, and why that's important. There are, Malcolm talks about many, clubs and things like that only took white money. And so Black people were kind of forced to create systems of wealth and businesses. And despite all of the things that were keeping them down at the time, and even today, right? You're living in a society where you don't have the same kind of access, or even if you do have, let's say it's something that you have broad access to, people don't know how to deal with certain things that affect, Black people. Another, a simple example of this again is hair, right? If you go into a store today, yes, there's shampoo and conditioner and all that, but my hair is very different from a white person's hair, right? And a lot of those companies and corporations are also run by, I mean, not just white people, but it's white men, right? And so the things that they use in those formulas are going to, like, it's in most cases like detrimental to a person's hair. So you have to create a business, a source of income in order to sort of kill two birds with one stone. If you have to take care of yourself, because there's this lack of trust that whatever it is, whatever the product is, it's not going to work as well. So I have to create the product for myself, and then I have to try to find people who need this and also create and also create a system where they can have access to this product. And the fact that they're, Black people have, in his words, been victims of a white man's social system. Again, this shows up. Even to this day, this still happens. He says that the ghettos were built for Black people by white people, either deliberately or by necessity, right? And he talks about the fact that a Negro who made $5,000 a year in a white man's world was unusual at the time, compared to a white man who made $50,000 a year. That's not unusual, right? That's another thing we still have to deal with. Even if you are a wealthy Black person, who somehow made it despite all of these challenges and are able to be, quote unquote, what we call rich and famous today, you're still not immune to sort of the anti-Blackness that goes on in any industry, right? We have stories like people who almost die because it doesn't matter that they're, rich and famous. All the police see when they look at you is Black, A story that comes to mind right now is, just as an example, is the athlete Serena Williams. She talks about how she almost died giving birth to her child because doctors did not believe she was in pain, and again, that's something else that continues to happen to this day. And Malcolm says of himself, he says, "I was a true hustler, uneducated, unskilled at anything honorable, and considered myself nervy and cunning enough to live by my wits, exploiting any prey that presented itself." And again, he makes the same kinds of parallels to today. And, I think if you were to read this book, or even if you had told me this book was written today, there would be no sense of shock, right? That's how little things have changed. It's the same story over and over and over and over and over again. And even when we talk about things that can be done in order to, at the very least, get, Black people at some sort of level playing field, we get shut down. The idea of reparations, for example, right, is a very hot topic. People don't want to hear it, because we've turned this whole conversation into, oh, well, if Black people don't succeed, it's their fault. Black people are not as smart, and Black people are not as, whatever it is, they don't want to go to college. They don't want to work. right? Which is interesting because even despite all the odds, the largest, the most educated demographic in America is Black women, right? But we still have, people saying like, oh, we can't hire Black people because there's a lack of talent. I believe it was Wells Fargo CEO that said that recently, right? Like, oh, we don't have enough Black talent to hire. So again, it's very much a catch 22, right? And in this idea that you have to be absolutely exceptional in order to have access. And then when you do get access, you have to deal with all of these systems that have been put in place in order to keep you down, right? You're already down to a certain extent, right? And when you're trying to pull yourself up, it's like, no, 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 no. We kept you down for a reason and you are going to stay down. And anytime there's an inch of progress, right, you take maybe one step forward, there's something else that's going to take you 10 steps back, right? So we overcame slavery and slavery was outlawed, but then we were paid back with the 13th Amendment that said, like, yeah, you're free, everything is great, except for people who are in jail, right? Or in captivity in some way. So what did the system do? The system made literally everything illegal. You could get 10 years, 20 years in prison for jaywalking, right? And so in order to really think about these things, especially in this sort of contemporary context, we have to think about the fact that this is a systemic problem. The system is broken, and the system is disproportionately affecting Black people, right? And the system is created in such a way that, again, the more proximity that you have to whiteness, the more likely it is that you are going to have access to these things. And I don't have that, right? Like, it's not a secret. You look at me, you can tell that I'm a Black woman, right? So automatically, I'm sort of excluded from this, um, and people make assumptions about my life. Again, Malcolm talks about like gangs that he was affiliated with and gang members that he knew. And he talked about going to jail as though it was a fact of life, right? It wasn't a question of if, but when. And again, we still to this day have that same kind of problem. But I wanted to mention, like, also just very quickly, and then I'll turn it over to you, Sister Lina, just the idea that you have to look at the breadth of someone's story, right? So if Malcolm X had died when he was 20 years old, right? He would have died a drug dealer, right? And as someone who had gone to prison and was smoking up a storm, like, he was so high all the time just to get through his life, right? But now everything flips, right? In prison, he finds Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, and then he comes out of it and sort of breaks away from that, goes to Hajj and sees that a lot of what Elijah Muhammad was saying about race and racism isn't true, right? So just the idea that your story is not complete until it is, and to think about that when we ourselves think about Black people in our communities, right? Because that's another it's a whole separate thing. But yeah, to think about that, to think about the sorts of things that people have had to overcome in their lives and the systems that have been put in place to keep them down. And if someone has overcome those odds and done what needs to be done in order to survive all of that, we need to, in whatever capacity we can, think about, think about them in and look at them through the lens of compassion, right? Black people are not systematically being put in prison by accident. Black people are not systematically being killed by police by accident. Black people are not, afforded home ownership by accident, right? These are all systems that have been put in place by the society that we live in, by the law as well. And, I also wanted to mention just very quickly, because we tend to think about all of this as and racism and all of the ways that that manifests as an American problem, right? Americans are very bad at this. Don't get me wrong, we are, but I think that there are echoes and remnants of this in the UK. There are echoes and remnants of this all around the world, really, because even if you look at someone like me, I am from Africa, right? I can point to the home that my father and my grandfather and my great-grandfather were born in. But even I am not exempt from facets of this story, because Africa was pillaged and stolen from by who? The British, right? They were our colonizers. And so this problem, the severity of it may be less. You and I can argue that until the end of time, but the British birthed this in a lot of ways, right? And so we can't just look at it and say, okay, this is great. Sister Hidaya came and talked about this, but like, this is their problem. She's American, and so this is their problem. No, this is very much something that happens and continues to happen in the West in general. Africans are still dealing with a lot of these things, and we have to think about ways and solutions to combat these problems. And if you're someone who has a business, hire Black talent if they're qualified, right? And don't put them through the, like, oh, but how qualified, and how many of the 15 degrees are from Harvard, and all of these other things. Think about all of this when you are thinking about how to go about, your day-to-day life, and what it means for Black people in particular to even be in this space, whether it's a job or it's school. Think about everything that they have had to overcome in order to get to where they are in that space with you, and come at it once again from the lens of compassion. And if there's a place where you can offer any kind of help, do that, and do what you can in whatever capacity that you can in order to help bridge this gap, because it's going to continue to be a problem until we decide to do something about it. I always say that the goal of any activist is not to be needed. We don't want to be activists. We want all of this to go extinct, no matter what you're talking about, right? Especially when you're talking about social justice. We don't want to be here. We want these systems eradicated, but the reason why we have to keep talking about these things is because they're not, and we still, again, 56 years later, we're still talking about it. Let's make sure that we're not talking about it in the next 56 years. Yeah, I mean, I think there are many different facets to that question, but I mean, do I think that, um, for instance, do I think that private schools should be phased out? That's a difficult question to answer. Do I think that public schools need to be better funded? Absolutely. Yeah. You know, there are a lot of things in the private school system that works better for certain students, and you don't want to take away from that. But very much so, the public school system is broken, very broken. It affects the kinds of teachers that are hired at these schools. Some people don't even want to work at certain schools, right? So that, yes, it's very much a product. The economic disparity is very, very much a product of the education system. It's very broken. The schools that we go to affect the kinds of jobs that we get. That's why a school like Harvard has a name, right? And it has global recognition. More so than a school like Howard University does, which is, you know, an HBCU and a historically Black college university. But yeah, should private schools be phased out? I don't know. I think that's a difficult question to answer because certain people go to private schools for certain reasons. For instance, the reason why you're allowed to have accredited, quote unquote, Islamic schools is because the law exists that allows for private schools to exist. And so if I answer yes to that question, then what I'm saying is, you know, Jewish schools shouldn't exist, right? What I'm saying is that, you know, Islamic schools shouldn't exist, and I don't think that's true. I think that people should be allowed to go where they feel most comfortable, whatever that looks like. Yes, get an education, get a fully accredited education, but at the same time, if I as a Black person feel more comfortable at an HBCU, you can't really tell me that I can't go to that school. Or, you know, or if I as a Muslim feel more comfortable seeing other Muslims, right? And being able to pray at school, and not feel guilty or ashamed by that, it's hard to say like we shouldn't have access to that. But yes, ethnic bias is still disgusting and prevalent and pervasive in our school systems, and income disparity definitely 100,000% affects this. So yeah, it's the education system is very broken. Yeah. So I mean, there's definitely conversations and people talking about it. Um, to what extent I believe it is going to, to put it simply, do I believe that it's going to be the law tomorrow? No, I don't. But there are always activists on the ground in Congress working on these sorts of things. But it's not, I would say it's not something that's caught fire in the same way that, you know, for instance, like Medicare for All has caught fire, which is another facet of this, right? Black people and their access to medical care. And I didn't really touch on it as I was speaking, but yeah, that's another, like, that's a whole, like, we could spend another hour just talking on that as well. But yeah, it hasn't really caught fire the same way that this has. But there is talk of it. And, I'm someone who, I used to be a realist, and now I'm kind of a cautious optimist. And so, yeah, there is a little bit, but there's a lot of work left to be done in order to get to the point where this could become a mainstream thing that is happening, and that's even before it gets to be a federal thing. I guess, like, combat some of the things that we're going through and be able to talk about it forcefully, and come out of that conversation without any kind of fear, right? But a lot of times, people don't have that, and so it's, I agree, on some level, that the way that he talks about women in some parts was sort of problematic, in certain contexts, and that's putting it very, 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 very mildly. But yeah, she eventually, she becomes an addict, and a prostitute, just with the influence of the world that she is living in, and everything that comes of that. And it's hard to find language for this, that is, appropriate. But I will say that I respect the fact that he takes the blame for this, right? And she was the victim of what he did. And I think that we don't hear very much of that, even today, right? It's very, very rare, at least in my life, to hear, a woman say to a man, "You hurt me, and this is the ways in which you hurt me." And to have him say, "Yes, okay," even if that wasn't my intention, and we could argue what his intention was, but yeah, even if that wasn't his intention, for him to say, "Well, look, I made you feel uncomfortable. I'm sorry about that." Yeah, you very, 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 very rarely, if ever, do you hear about that and talk about it. So yeah, I respect the fact that he at least acknowledged that he had a role to play in everything that sort of happened to her and the trauma that he inflicted on her. It's both easy and difficult to answer this question. Short answer is yes and no. I know that doesn't answer it at all. But I think that you understand things to the level that you are willing to put yourself in someone else's shoes. I think that's what creates an environment for understanding. Seeing yourself in someone else is what creates a culture of understanding. And that's something that we're lacking. And, a simple example of this today is COVID, right? This is COVID era. The reason why every single thing in my life for the past year has been virtual is because of this disease, right? But every day I have had to have conversations with people in my own family. Wear a mask, social distance, wear a mask, social distance, right? And it's I'm kind of this broken record who talks about it over and over and over and over again, mostly because they don't listen. But the reason why people are reluctant to do it is because they're oh, it's not real. It's never going to happen to me. and therefore, like, why should I care? Number one, you don't know that, right? And number two, you don't have to wait until you are diagnosed with COVID-19 in order to feel sympathy for someone who has been, affected by COVID-19 in some way, right? I don't have to have buried a family member in order to take this seriously. And I think that there is something to be said for experience making your understanding of something richer. But I also think that where this is concerned, unless you're white, we've all faced some kind of oppression, right? And so it comes down to the idea of how willing are you to put yourself in the shoes of someone else and go from there, and also listen as well, right? No gaslighting, no like, oh, that doesn't happen, that never happens, or anything of that sort. That language, that kind of dismissive language, undermines the point that someone else is trying to make. So I mean, do I think that non-Black Muslims will ever have an understanding of the injustices that Black people have faced? If they want to, yeah. Do I think that they will feel it in much the same way? No, because you never know how anything feels until it happens to you. But can you empathize? Yes, you can. Can you do what you can in order to dismantle the system? Yes, you can. You know how many wealthy Muslims I know? Right? But at the same time, do you know how many of those wealthy business owners hire Black talent? For example, it's appalling, right? And we're talking about people in your own community, people who believe in the same God and the same prophet, and in most cases the same imams that you do, right? And there's still a problem of like, they don't even want to take your resume. Right? So I'm not saying like give someone a job because they're Black and Muslim and that's it. I'm saying this person graduated from this fantastic school, they have these skills, at least look at the resume. And they're not going to, because like, oh, or if they do, it's like a one Black person, because that's the quota, right? Like we can't have more than that, right? So you're never going to feel it. You're never going to, unless you are Black yourself, you don't know the fear that I have when my father or my brother get into a car and leave and go somewhere. You don't know that, right? And I hope that you don't. I hope that no one gets to know that fear. But my point is, we all have a role to play in order to ensure that I no longer have that fear as well. I don't think we can. I do not think we can. And the asker can feel free to elaborate if I don't answer the question effectively, but I don't think you can move from the past. I think that the ripple effect is there for a reason. And I think that if you do not learn from the ripple effect, there is a high probability that you are going to repeat it. There is a reason why we keep looking back, because that informs how we move forward now, right? I mean, even just to put it simply, in the Islamic tradition, right? You have to look back in order to look, forward. You can't just be like, oh, the prophet died and it's all done. So like, why do we need this? Why do we need this book anymore, right? So no, you can't. The past is always going to inform the present. But the question is, how do we ensure that we get better, right? We learn from the mistakes that people before us have made and build on the progress that they have made as well, right? So no, you're never going to be able to move forward from the past. You're always going to be carrying that with you in some way, shape, or form. Now, to the extent that it rules your life, especially if it's negative, that's different, right? You depending on what we're talking about, that's different. Like, for instance, if I think about all of the atrocities that have been inflicted on Black bodies, I may never get out of bed again, ever. You know, the fact that the whole segment of gynecology exists because doctors operated on Black women without anesthesia, right? That whole segment of medicine only exists because we tortured Black women. You know, Black men too, but mostly Black women, right? If I go too deep down the rabbit hole of that, it can be debilitating, right? So there are aspects of it where it's not healthy to focus on, but am I ever going to be able to completely neglect it? No. Even if we fix racism tomorrow, I'm still going to be talking about this, you know, in some way, shape, or form, because I continuously need to make sure that we do not repeat this. And in order to make sure that we do not repeat it, we have to keep going back to it and reaffirming the commitment to not go back and do this. Because if we don't, it's very easy to fall back and into the traps of you know, doing the very same things again. First of all, reparations is a difficult topic, not just because of you know, slavery and everything that happened, but also because, again, just like when we're talking about, you know, Black economics, right? It encompasses so many different things, right? And affects everything. So, I mean, it's very difficult to say what the best way is to I guess go about this. Do I feel like reparations, you know, should be given? 110%. Yes, I do. What should that look like? Should it look like just money being given to people? Yes. Should it also look like funding for the rebuilding of infrastructure? Yeah. Does it look like, you know, investing in schools? Yeah. So all of these, does it look like investing in healthcare? Yes. Does it look like training for everybody where this is concerned, whether it be, you know, our politicians or our doctors? Yeah. So I don't really know how we would come up with a plan that can be, first of all encompassing, right? And also systemic, in the same way that the fight to keep us down has been systemic, in the same way that even when America in particular, and the world really, but in particular America, sort of said, okay, slavery is over, they still they were like, yeah, slavery is over, but, you know, and there's an asterisk on everything, and we're still paying the price of that to this day. Yeah, okay, give people money, but there should be the asterisk of what else are we going to do? You know, which schools are we going to train? Which school teachers are we going to train? How are we going to put this in the curriculum and in the system so that, you know, we can dismantle this from the ground up? Again, just like we built it from the ground up, we need to make sure that we have those very same systems in place. I don't think it's just about money, though. I think money is an excellent start. You know, and that's also something that's a struggle, because you have to think about, like, if we print, I don't know, what is it, like the figure, the last time I read about this, they were like, yeah, we're thinking like $4 trillion, which is like nothing, right? Like, I mean, it's a lot, but it's nothing. Especially if you consider that that is going to be divided amongst, what is it, like the lowest estimate of people who would get that money would be like 35 million people, right? That's the lowest possible estimate. So yeah, like every single thread, right, in the sort of clothing of this system has to be pulled apart, right, and sort of examined in order to make sure that we do this effectively. That's the only way to get even close to a level playing field. And I don't know that I have an answer for how to effectively do that. But I think, again, like if we're living in a world where the average Black family makes 17,000 to a white family's 171,000. Yeah, I mean, even if it's like $1,000 every month extra for, I don't know, 5 years or 10 years or whatever, that's a huge help to someone who's making 17,000. But in addition to that, yeah, healthcare, food access, medical access, mental health access. That's another thing I forgot to mention that comes up again and again in Malcolm's life is access to mental health care for his mother, and how that affected his childhood, right? The brutal murder of his father affected her. And, you know, and the insurance company was like, no, that was a suicide. Come on now, you know, like it's again, so many of these things are intertwined with one another. And there is no one right or wrong answer. I think that America needs to examine all of the places in which it has done wrong here, and one by one kind of comb through that and figure out, okay, what is racist? Okay, well, we're not going to be redlining anymore. Okay, well, Black people deserve equal rights to healthcare and all these other stuff. Like, we're not, okay, how do we make sure that that happens? So just like, again, all of these things were baked into the law, we need to learn how to separate them. And it takes a lot of work, and it's not just about money. It's about education, it's about infrastructure, it's about healthcare, it's about all of those things that contribute to a person's humanity. Okay, so in terms of, there are a couple of different things. In terms of documentaries, I highly recommend watching 13th. If you haven't already, it is a documentary by Ava DuVernay, I think her name is. She examines the 13th Amendment and kind of how it has led to today, right now, everything that we're seeing right now, and how also it was very much designed to affect everything that we are seeing right now. In terms of books, so there are a couple. Black Economics is pretty good. I'm totally going to butcher the author's name, but we're gonna do our best. We're gonna do our best. Jawanza Kunjufu, I believe, is the name. Yes, I am African. Do not take my African card, but but yes. So that's a good one as well. From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation is another fantastic one that touches a lot on this idea that everything that we're talking about. The Color of Money is another one. Let me see. Race and Economics is another one. How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney is another one. The Half Has Never Been Told is another one. Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty good, like, that's a pretty, you guys are gonna be, you have a lot of work. So, so yeah, those are just some books that I have seen. I highly recommend I Am Not Your Negro as well, if we are talking about documentaries. The works of James Baldwin, honestly, all of them, literally all of them. He speaks, you know, very frankly, as he should, about a lot of the things that we've talked about today and beyond. So yeah, definitely, that's another one.